Continuation of Brendan Dassey court transcript reading. Day 1, continuation of Kratz's opening statement, continuing on page 75. Was her body burnt and mutilated like Brendan tells you? Lots and lots and lots of evidence about this. First of all, the burn area in the burn pit itself. You'll also, by the way, hear from some witnesses. Brendan's now stepfather, Scott Taddick, will actually be called to testify. I'm sure he won't want to, but he will say on the 31st, that night, between 7:30 and 7:45 in the evening, he saw Brendan and Stephen tending that fire, and we'll talk about the flames being so high behind the garage. He not only sees the fire, he sees Brendan and Stephen Avery, so an eyewitness will put Brendan there, just like he said he was, back tending that fire. You'll hear about the bones being recovered and being charred, and we've already talked about this particular bone, but Dr. Eisenberg will also identify every bone that is found. These anthropologists are able to look at a little fragment of bone and tell you that it comes from this part of the leg or that part of the arm or that part of the spine. And she'll testify, and she'll tell you that every bone of Teresa Halbach is represented in that burn pit in the back. You'll even hear from a dentist, the forensic dentist, Dr. Donald Smiley, who found a particular tooth number 31 on Teresa Halbach. On the left is Teresa's x-ray when she was alive of that particular tooth, and on the right is what's found in the burn pit, in the burn area. You'll be able to match them up for yourself, that Teresa's tooth number 31, one of the back teeth on the left side of her jaw, was recovered from the burn area. It says that a car seat was thrown in the fire. Do we have evidence of that? Can we prove that? Can we corroborate that evidence? Absolutely. We will show you, and in fact, we'll bring into this courtroom the remains of that burned car seat. Two-man job, ladies and gentlemen. 2 people required to throw that car seat, to carry that particular metal grave car seat. Brendan says the SUV was driven to the pit area. You'll find not only where the SUV was found, where the crushed or car crusher is. You'll also see some diagrams that Brendan actually places where Uncle Steve and I dropped off and hid that vehicle to conceal this crime. Brendan said that it was concealed with branches and a car hood. Did that happen? Absolutely. Branches and a car hood, exactly as Brendan described, will be found concealing that car. Members of the jury, 2-man job. We'll probably bring in that large piece of heavy car hood to show you that Brendan and Uncle Steve leaned that and concealed that car. Were Teresa's license plates removed as Brendan said? Absolutely. We find the license plates in a junked vehicle. Was Teresa's car hood opened up by Uncle Steve as Brendan says? Well, on April 3, again, as a result of Brendan's statements, law enforcement swabs. They take a Q-tip and they swab the hood latch, reaching up underneath the hood, just to see if we can get a DNA profile. Sherry Culhane does. She gets a full profile. That's Stephen Avery's sweat. Stephen Avery's sweat is found on the hood latch, just like should happen if Brendan is to be believed that Uncle Stephen went under the hood. Again, facts not known by law enforcement at the time Brendan made these statements. Brendan says that the garage floor was cleaned with paint thinner. You're going to hear from a man by the name of John Ertl from the crime lab who will talk about a 3 or 4 foot circle just to the left and behind the riding tractor, which is a big bleach stain. Mr. Ertl will talk about that bleach stain. You'll see that bleach and paint thinner are recovered. But perhaps most importantly, Brendan himself hands over to Investigator Fossbender his jeans. He says, "These were the pants I was wearing that night, and these pants are splashed with bleach from cleaning Uncle Steve's garage." Brendan said that Teresa Halbach's key was put into the bedroom. You already know that the key was found in Uncle Steve's bedroom. Interestingly, Brendan says that the clothes of Teresa Halbach, after they cleaned up, were burned. They were thrown onto the burn pile. Little bit harder to prove that her clothes are actually burned, but we did it. You're going to hear from a young lady today by the name of Katie Halbach. Katie's actually sitting in the front row, Teresa's sister. She knows about Teresa's clothes, and Teresa owned a pair of what's called Dassey Fuentes jeans. They're jeans, you're going to hear, that are sold at a Kohl's department store. She kidded her sister. Katie kidded Teresa, as sisters sometimes do, about having those kind of jeans. But you're going to hear that after Teresa's death, those jeans were missing. Those jeans were gone. Teresa was wearing those jeans on the 31st of October. Jeans have little rivets on them, and those of you that are wearing jeans can kind of take a look at this a little bit later, but Dassey Fuentes has 6 different rivets that actually say the words Dassey Fuentes on them. You're going to hear that the 5 of those 6 rivets were recovered from the burn area right behind Stephen's garage. Also, a zipper was found and some other clothing items were found. So as Brendan Dassey, that nobody else knew about the burning of the clothes, Brendan Dassey, when he says that we burned her clothes, we're able to verify that. Was Avery's finger cut and actively bleeding? Of course it was. We have a photo of it, and we have Avery's blood, which Mr. Stalkey, the blood spatter expert, will tell you how all of those are left. Brendan says that Teresa's cell phone and camera were burned in Avery's burn barrel. Burn barrel was outside the car. You're going to hear and read a report from a gentleman by the name of Curtis Thomas. Mr. Thomas works at the FBI in Virginia. Mr. Thomas got to see all these electronics which were recovered from Mr. Avery's burn barrel. And guess what was in there? Teresa Halbach's Motorola V3 Razr cell phone, Teresa Halbach's PowerShot A310 digital camera are found, just like Brendan said they would be. Lastly, did Avery's girlfriend call twice on October 31? Phone records will indicate that a woman by the name of Jody Stachowski, the girlfriend of Stephen Avery, called twice on the 31st, just like Brendan said. The evidence in this case, members of the jury, isn't just going to be based on the statements of a young man, aren't just going to be the fanciful expressions or imagination of somebody. We're going to be able to prove to you in this case that things the public didn't know, things the police didn't know, were provided by a young man who was at the scene. Was he there? Absolutely. Did he help? Absolutely. And so the jury's role then will be to decide these facts. Your role as a jury will be to decide whether Brendan's admissions of involvement in this case, knowing things that nobody else knows, that only the murderer and the murderer's accomplice could know in this case, and you are to search for the truth. The evidence, members of the jury, at the conclusion of this case is not going to show that Brendan Dassey was at the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence is going to show that Brendan Dassey was at the right place at the right time. Teresa Halbach got lucky. She got lucky that there was a young man who showed up. She got lucky that there was one person that could save her life. But the choices that Brendan Dassey made, the choices that he made with his uncle, ensured that instead of leaving, instead of just saying no, instead of talking Uncle Steve out of it, which were all choices that he had, instead of calling 911, instead of calling his mother or a family member, or instead of actively rescuing this girl, Brendan Dassey chose to rape this young girl, to involve himself in her murder, and to help dispose of and mutilate this 25-year-old body. Choices require consequences and accountability, and at the conclusion of this case, we're asking that you find the defendant guilty. Thank you, Judge. The court. All right. Attorney Fremgen. Thank you. I don't have any audio visuals, so I'll apologize ahead of time. You have to listen to me instead. On October 31 of 2005, Brendan Dassey came home about 3:45 from high school, with his brother Blaine. Not unusual for Brendan to come home with Blaine. Every day they came home the same way. Dropped off at the end of the street, the access road, the Avery Road accesses to his house, and began to walk down the road. It takes about 5 minutes to get to the house from the mailboxes. And as they're walking, they start to talk about who gets to use the phone first to call a friend to go trick-or-treating. They race home, and Blaine wins the race, so he gets the phone first. Blaine calls his friend Jason. They set up a time to meet to go trick-or-treating, and Brendan plays some video games. He watches a little bit of TV, and about 5 o'clock, his mom comes home and makes supper for Blaine and Brendan. About 20 after 5, maybe 5:30, Blaine leaves to meet Jason, his friend, to go trick-or-treating, and Barb Taddick, now Taddick, was Yonda, meets her boyfriend, fiancé at the time, at about 5:30 to go up to Green Bay to visit with his mother who's in the hospital. She leaves, and Brendan is still at home, watching TV, playing some video games, and at about 5:45, Blaine's boss, his name is Mike Cornley, Brendan used to work for Mike as well, calls to talk to Blaine. Talks for about 5 minutes, and Brendan takes a message for Blaine that Mike called. Shortly after that time, Stephen Avery calls. Stephen Avery, obviously, as you know, is Brendan's uncle. Lives about a couple hundred feet from the house. Calls and asks if he wants to come over to watch a bonfire that Stephen has set. Brendan says yes. About 15 minutes later, Steve calls again, asks Brendan, "What's taking you so long?" Brendan's kind of putsy. He's changing his pants, putting on a sweatshirt. It's a little bit chilly for an October night, and he goes over to the bonfire. And when he gets there, it's a little bit dark now, about 7-ish. He drives around with his uncle. Stephen has his mother's golf cart, and they're traveling around the yard picking up debris. Wood, an old cabinet, some tires, and a van seat. And as they collect the items, they begin to pile them up next to, or just to the side of this little area behind Stephen's garage, where he's got the bonfire going. They throw some items onto the bonfire, put some other items off to the side, And they do that for about 4 or 5 trips around the yard, collecting debris, collecting garbage, and they begin to toss the garbage onto the fire throughout the night. After they're done cleaning up the yard, Stephen asks Brendan if he wants to help clean up a mess in his garage. Brendan says yes. They go into the garage, and there's a small area behind the lawnmower as if something had spilled. Stephen takes some gasoline and pours it onto this little area, and they use some clothing, old rags, that sop up the mess, and as they begin to clean it up with these old clothes and old rags, they throw them onto the fire. And they do that for about a half hour. Stephen tries some gasoline and paint thinner to help clean up the area, and some bleach as well. After about a half hour, they go back out by the bonfire, and Stephen gets a call on his cell phone. It's from Brendan's mom, Barb. She calls over to see if Brendan is over by Stephen by the bonfire. He says he is. Reminds Stephen to tell Brendan that he needs to be home before 10, and asks that he has a sweatshirt or a coat on because, again, it's kind of a chilly night. Brendan never talks to his mom, but he knows he now has to be home by 10. They watch the bonfire for a while and then toss the van seat onto the back of the fire. About 9:30, quarter to 10, Brendan goes home. Gets home, watches some TV, and goes to bed. Now, what I've just done is explain to you what we believe the evidence will show that happened on October 31. As Mr. Kratz has pointed out, that's called the opening statement. I think it's more like a story. It's like reading a novel. A trial is kind of a novel. Novels have characters, and you'll see witnesses. Novels have a plot or some sort of theme. Each side, the prosecutor and the defense, we each have a theme we want to present to you, and then there's always a conclusion. Now, differences between a trial and a novel is that the conclusion hasn't been written. That's your job. At the end of this case, after each attorney has had an opportunity to present witnesses and evidence for you, had an opportunity to give what's called a closing argument, after the judge instructs you on the law, it's up to you and you alone to finish the story, to decide what actually happened. Now, not unlike a story or a novel, there can be turns and twists. Mr. Kratz pointed out in their theme, there are turns and twists, and we'll do the same. There may be similarities between novels and trials, but there are some differences as well. For instance, when I read a story, sometimes I get a little anxious and I want to find out what happened, who did it. So I tend to want to skip some of the pages, pass up on a chapter, maybe even take a peek at the very end. But you can't do that. Part of that, and the obvious reason, is that the court controls the tempo and flow of information here. We can't just start now and we'll skip to the end to the closing arguments. You need to hear the evidence. And when we talk in jury selection about burden of proof and presumption of innocence, one of the questions I had for you, and I believe most of you raised your hands or at least nodded affirmatively, that you want to hear from both sides, and you can't do that if you skip to the end. You can't do that if you hear just one side. As Mr. Kratz pointed out, they get to go first. They'll present you with number of witnesses, days and days of evidence, exhibits, photographs, testimony. And when they're done, we get an opportunity to provide you with the same. But if you don't presume Brendan innocent, even after they're done with their part of the case, after they rest and allow us an opportunity to present witnesses for you, then you've already skipped to the end of the book. You've passed a number of chapters and you've denied the presumption of innocence. And what I was most impressed by on jury selection is I believe every person here agreed, raised their hand that yes, we need to presume Brendan innocent at all times until it's time for you to deliberate. Your final time to go from here into the back room to make your decision. It is important to remember who is on trial. This is not the Stephen Avery trial, and it seems so simple to say that, but it's very difficult to do. In February, late or early March, when the Stephen Avery trial was going on, I would often go to court, different county, and attorneys and even a judge would ask me, shouldn't you be over in Calumet? Isn't that where the Avery trial is going on? Yep, that's true. My in-laws, my neighbor, even my pastor, said the same thing to me, and I'd have to politely tell them that each time, well, that's a different trial. I represent Brendan Dassey, the nephew, and it's a different case entirely. And I believe that's what the state wants to present to you as well. They need to present evidence about the Stephen Avery involvement, but I think they want to focus on Brendan as well, and to that I agree. This is not Stephen Avery. You'll hear days and days of evidence about Stephen Avery, his DNA, his blood found in the SUV, about the bone fragments behind his house in a burn pit, about the bullet fragment found in his garage. You'll hear about the ignition key found in his bedroom. But I don't believe you'll hear evidence about Brendan Dassey's DNA. You won't hear the same evidence involving Brendan Dassey. There won't be any DNA, no blood, no saliva, no sweat, no hair, nothing. No fingerprints, no science that's going to point you to Brendan Dassey. Not the science that points to Stephen Avery.